and active interactions with their home churches. Now, I'll be your host for today for these discussions. I would like to share that today's congressional briefings was brought to you by a coalition of 16 organizations. They include Amnesty International USA, 21 Wilberforce, Hindus for Human Rights, Indian American Muslim Council, Indian International Christian Concern, Jubilee Campaign, Dalit Solidarity Forum, New York State Council of Churches, Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America, India Civil Watch International, Students Against Hindutva Ideology, Center for Pluralism, American Muslim Institution, International Society for Peace and Justice, Association of Indian Muslims of America, and Humanism Project Australia. First, I would like to invite representatives of organizations that are co-sponsoring a few for a couple of 1 or 2 minutes of brief introduction. First, I would like to, then after that, I would make my comments before the speakers are invited to share their comments. First, I would like to invite Nikhil Mandalapati, the Advocacy Director of Human Rights, Hindus for Human Rights, to make his brief remarks. So, Nikhil?
Sure. Rashid Bhai, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, for those of you who are watching on Zoom. And thank you to the distinguished panelists who are joining us today and to all the event organizers. My name is Nikhil Mandalaparthi, and I serve as Advocacy Director with Hindus for Human Rights. And we represent the significant proportion of the Hindu community in the US who believe in pluralism, civil rights, and human rights for all. When President Biden meets Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Washington, D.C. this week, we believe, as the title of this briefing indicates, that human rights must be on their agenda. India has been on a worrying trajectory for several years now. We have seen rising mob violence against religious minorities and Dalits. We have seen students, academics, journalists, and human rights activists arrested under draconian colonial-era laws, often with little or no evidence. The rights of women, indigenous people, young interfaith couples, farmers, all have come under attack. And in all of this, we are seeing that the Indian state, the government, the judiciary, the police is actively complicit in this violence. And that's why we support USER's recommendation for the past 2 years to the State Department to designate India as a country of particular concern, or CPC. Quite simply, we hope this week that President Biden will put pressure on Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government to respect its own constitution, which guarantees freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and equal rights for all. As Indian Americans, we are deeply concerned about our homeland. Last year, a survey conducted by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace found that the majority of Indian Americans believe that Hindu nationalism, the political ideology championed by Prime Minister Modi and his party, poses a threat to India's democracy. Hindu nationalism also threatens America's democracy. Just as one example, we know that individuals affiliated with Hindu nationalist groups were present at the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th this year. And as our highest elected representative, President Biden has a responsibility to communicate these concerns to Prime Minister Modi. As Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated during his visit to India this summer, there are few relationships in the world that are more vital than the one between the United States and India. But relationships must be built on truth and honesty. Friends should be able to hold each other accountable, and turning a blind eye to India's backsliding democracy and constitutional rights not only hurts India, but it hurts the United States as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil. Next, may I ask Rashid Ahmed, the President of the Indian American Muslim Council, to make his remarks, please. Rashid?
Thank you, John. When President Biden meets Prime Minister Modi, we hope he understands that along with his political interests and the interest of American business community and the defense sector interest in selling hundreds of billions of dollars of military hardware, software, and services over the years to India, we hope President is cognizant that when he is meeting and hosting Modi, he's not just hosting Indian Prime Minister, but he's also hosting, shaking hands, and breaking bread with someone who has earned titles like Butcher of Gujarat, modern-day Nero, whom the Time magazine calls divider-in-chief, under whose watch India is downgraded as partly free and turned India into an autocratic democracy. President Biden would be meeting someone who was denied a diplomatic visa and whose existing visa was revoked for 9 years before he became Prime Minister. Allow me to share with you a statement by State Department released by State Department by then US Ambassador to India on March 21, 2005 on the issue of Mr. Narendra Modi's visa. The Chief Minister of Gujarat State, Mr. Narendra Modi, applied for diplomatic visa to visit the United States. On March 18, 2005, the United States Department of State denied Mr. Modi this visa, and Mr. Modi's existing tourist and business visa was also revoked because he was responsible for or directly carried out particularly severe violations of religious freedom. Mr. Modi's racist upbringing started when, at the age of 8, he joined a paramilitary racist organization of which he is still a proud member. It is this organization's member who killed Gandhi. True to Mr. Modi's hate for anyone other than Hindu nationalists, Mr. Modi does not even welcome even Hindus who disagree with his fascist policies. I hope someone in White House reminds President Biden he would be meeting who instituted a religious test for Indian citizenship, implementing what ideologues of racist and militant ideology of Hindutva had imagined India almost a century back as free of Jews, Christians, and Muslims as its citizens. This is the same Prime Minister who goes around in the daytime praising Gandhi and in the night worshipping Gandhi's killers. I hope President Biden's aides reminds his own statements as the candidate Biden. Let me close with candidate Biden's policy statement. Quote, in Kashmir, the Indian government should take all necessary steps to restore rights for all the people of Kashmir. Restrictions on dissent, such as preventing peaceful protest or shutting or slowing down the internet, weakens democracy, candidate Biden said. The statement continued, Joe Biden has been disappointed by the measures that the government of India has taken with the implementation and aftermath of the National Register of Citizens in Assam and the passage of Citizenship Amendment Act into law. These measures are inconsistent with the country's long traditions of secularism and with sustaining a multi-ethnic and multi-religious democracy. End of the statement. I hope President Biden makes it a priority to repeat what he said he believes in as the candidate in person when he meets Mr. Modi's. Families of thousands of Indian citizens who died under Mr. Modi's watch and thousands of Indian citizens who were locked up in the jail for merely dissenting in supposedly the largest democracy are watching President Biden and the United States. All eyes are on President Biden, and we hope President Biden makes a public statement after meeting Mr. Modi that aligns with American values, not his political conventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashid Bhai, for that comments. Now, before I invite our first speaker, Mr. Govindacharya, I would like to make a brief comment, and then we will have, in the order, Mr. Govindacharya, and then Ms. Nayin Madinza, then John. So here, we all know why Mr. Modi is coming to Washington. He is coming tomorrow for a discussion with other Quad members. Of course, the purpose and mission of Quad is very critical to the stability and commerce in Indian Ocean corridor, South China Sea, and generally across the Indo-Pacific region. It is not just a human rights issue affecting the Christians, Muslims, and a vast majority of Hindus and Dalits only. Washington is so worried about the strategic interest and national security interest in the Indo-Pacific region that some in the administration are willing to make the same mistake that Washington has made over and over in the past. When America's national security interest in Afghanistan required the full cooperation of countries like Pakistan, our officials did overrule the domestic developments in Pakistan when the treatment of Hindus, the Christians, the Ahmadis there reached appalling levels. Washington argued very effectively at that time, saying that we are not in Pakistan to police them. We are there only for our national security interest. They argued that Pakistan's own constitution will take care of whatever is needed domestically. But such arguments made all the sense at the time. I do not want to dwell on the details of those decisions, but we all know what that policy has brought us today. We are faced with the challenges in Indo-Pacific region now, and this time the challenge is formidable. We do need India, Australia, Japan, and other nations in the region to meet these challenges, but the question is, at what cost? What kind of India do we need to partner with? Are we willing to override the threat of religious nationalism in India as an internal matter, like we did in Pakistan 20 years ago, for equally challenging situations at the time? Or can we have a policy and an approach that makes common sense? Should we ignore the threat to the very identity of the people of India that makes them a unique nation? Can we afford to ignore the concerns of a civil society? Can we dismiss the multiple incidents of harassment and vigilante-style attacks on Christians and Muslims and Dalit families, dismissing it as saying that it is an internal law and order issue which the judiciary in India should handle, while we quite willingly ignore the root cause of these problems? What a civil unrest or loss of basic rights of individuals in India means to the national security interest of the United States and the commercial interest of the international community, including that of India. We have four excellent panelists today. Our keynote speaker is Nadine Mayenza, the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. She will be joining us after initial comments from Mr. Govindacharya. Give me a second.
Should I go ahead, John?
You go. I'm trying to give you an introduction here. Give me 1 second. Mr. Govindacharya is the country specialist for India with the Amnesty International. He is based in the West Coast. Amnesty International was shut down last year in India by Mr. Modi government because they exposed the police atrocities against the Muslim civilians in New Delhi. Now, Mr. Govindacharya will have about 10 minutes to make his comments, and then we will have Nadine Mayenza. Govind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. For my talk today, I want to outline specific steps that the US government must ask of India, especially as India takes on an increased priority in Washington as part of the Quad. The US Congress and the Biden administration has an essential role to play in this, and it's vital that they are fully aware of the crucial time in US-India relations and press Prime Minister Modi while he is here in the United States this week. It's a perfect opportunity. They should not miss it. The US government should press Modi to repeal and amend laws that jeopardize human rights and to reform the overbroad legal frameworks that authorities have used to target activists, opposition leaders, and human rights defenders. In fact, as John mentioned, Amnesty International India was one of those that was targeted using the Enforcement Directorate, which is an agency of the central government, in a series of raids over the course of several years, culminating in our closure in September 2020. The Prime Minister should hear from President Biden about the grave concerns raised about the discriminatory, arbitrary, capricious National Register of Citizens in Assam. And furthermore, in Assam, in the past few days, we have seen the recently re-elected Assam state government carry out a drive to forcibly evict hundreds of households in a town in Assam. Most of those displaced in this outrageous demolition of homes are Muslims of Bengali origin. India is historically viewed by the US government as a key ally and strategic partner of the US, and as a regional example of the rule of law. The perceptions, however, have been increasingly undermined by the Indian government's misuse of the police and the judiciary to punish dissent and facilitate violations of human rights. Again, I reiterate that the Biden administration has the perfect opportunity this week to convey its displeasure over these human rights violations and to ask Prime Minister Modi to end these violations immediately. In particular, the central government has weaponized laws purporting to be quote unquote anti-terrorist, such as the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, known as the FCRA, and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA, using these laws against human rights defenders, activists, and religious minorities. An amendment passed in September 2020 to the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which regulates foreign income for NGOs, has been criticized by human rights groups as a tool to suppress and constrain India's amazingly vibrant civil society. The amendment actually dramatically reduces the ability of NGOs and civil society organizations in the country to access foreign funds by prohibiting sub-granting, and it requires recipients to open State Bank of India accounts, as well as mandates pre-authorization of fund transfers. The FCRA prohibits the use of foreign funds to support activities that might endanger, quote unquote, the public interest, the economic interest, or security of India. These are terms that allow for inconsistent, arbitrary application of the law and place at high risk persecution of groups and organizations that have been critical of the government. And so while the FCRA has been used to undermine organizations in a financial way, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the UAPA, is one of many laws that allows Indian authorities to target individual activists, protesters, human rights defenders, and religious minorities. It's just one of many. There's also sedition laws from the British era, during the colonial era. There are other laws during the colonial era, but this one has been used with increasing frequency. The UAPA compromises the right to a free trial by restricting the right to bail and extending the length of time suspects can be detained without trial. And the problem is that people will be in prison jail awaiting time, and they may not be released for months or years after, only to be acquitted of charges or charges being dropped years down the line. Meanwhile, their lives are destroyed by being in jail awaiting trial on often trumped up charges. It is a tool of harassment used to target, intimidate, and imprison those who are critical of the government. Slow investigative processes and stringent bail provisions have allowed Indian authorities to detain those who have been accused of laws for years. And so that's what's been happening. It's been happening with increasing frequency as well in the aftermath of the violence in Delhi that was stoked by a series of hate speeches given by politicians shortly before and during previous President Trump's visit to India in January 2020. So in practice, both laws have had a devastating impact on Indian civilians, civil society, and human rights. The FCRA has resulted in catastrophic disruptions for access for humanitarian organizations that were working with local NGOs and other organizations during the devastating second wave of the COVID-19 back in the spring and early summer in India, which left many lakhs of people dead. Among those lost during this time was Father Stan Swami, who was an 84-year-old human rights defender with Parkinson's disease, who had been jailed with advanced Parkinson's under the UAPA and whom Indian authorities refused to release despite widespread outcry as part of the jailing of other Bhima Koregaon activists. These Bhima Koregaon activists, as well as journalists and even politicians, have had their phones and computers targeted by malware, which the company that produces the malware says can only be bought by governments. The Biden administration and members of Congress must underscore to Modi that the Indian government's use of these purportedly, quote unquote, anti-terrorist laws to crush opposition and target activists undermines the strategic partnership with the United States. There needs to be a political cost to the Modi government's continued efforts to erode and abuse India's political and legal institutions to violate human rights. A government that misuses its own anti-terrorism laws to shore up political power, extinguish dissent, and target minorities is not a reliable security partner. Okay. The US should insist to Modi that a strong India-US partnership depends on the Indian government's urgent repeal or amendment of these repressive laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Govind, for that comment. It's always a pleasure having you on our panels. Thank you again. Now, let's go to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom Chairperson, Nadine Mayenza. She's with us on the panel. Before I invite her, let us hear comments from three members of Congress: Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey, Michigan Congressman Andy Levin, and Illinois Congresswoman Mary Newman. Can we have their comments, please? It's a pre-recorded comments, and soon after that, and I will introduce Ms. Mayenza for the next. Thank you. There's no voice. All right, let's, I think we are having some technical difficulties.
The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom released a chilling report this year describing what it called, quote, Hindu nationalist policies resulting in systemic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom.
The government's targeting of social and political activities and crackdown on free speech and their religiously motivated discrimination against minorities cannot be viewed in isolation.
From disinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic that targeted religious minorities, to attempts to ban interfaith marriages, to riots in Delhi, where more than 50 people died and 200 were injured, most of them Muslims, in which mobs supportive of Hindu nationalism, quoting again, operated with impunity, using brutal force to single out Muslims, attack mosques, and destroy homes and businesses in majority Muslim neighborhoods.
In the last 7 years, hundreds of Muslims just walking down the street have been attacked by vigilante mobs. They've been lynched. It is a travesty of justice, and I'm horrified by it. The worst front of the government's persecution is being faced by India's 200 million Muslims, who now face statelessness thanks to this horrible National Register for Citizens, or the NRC as it's called. Across India, Muslims have been subjected to killings alarming even the United Nations officials. Amnesty International has documented the violence against Muslims, whether from the police in response to the protests against the citizenship law, or in the Indian capital of New Delhi last year by rioting mobs who were allegedly part of Hindu nationalists.
But these attacks are not new. They're part of a pattern we've seen becoming increasingly clear and prevalent under Prime Minister Modi.
There were reports of religiously motivated killings, assaults, riots, discrimination, vandalism, and actions restricting the right of individuals to practice and speak about their religious beliefs.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that compilation of the videos. Now, let's go to Chairwoman Nadine Maenza. She is with us here. She is Ms. Maenza is a noted speaker, writer, and a policy expert with more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate for working families and a champion for international religious freedom. Now, she is the president of Patriot Voices, where she provides her expertise to shape the organization's special emphasis on public policies that support working families. Drawing on her extensive network and coalition building experiences, she has helped build unique coalitions on issues such as paid family leave, healthcare, tax reform, and international religious freedom. Since June 2021, she has served as the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, having been reappointed by the White House in May of 2020 to a second 2-year term. She served as vice chair in 2019. She has represented USERF in delegations to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, Bahrain, Indonesia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Thailand, Taiwan, and Uzbekistan. Please note, India is not on that list yet. India has refused to allow the commission to visit the country. She is most honored to have met with persecuted communities of various faiths from around the world. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Institute for Global Engagement, the Sinjar Academy, and the Freedom Research Foundation. Previously, she was chairman of the Hardwired Global, an organization working to stop religious oppression around the world. Nadine has advised several major organizations on faith engagement, policy development, and strategic partnerships through the Clapham Group, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the College Board, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Importantly, she has played a leading role in shaping the USERF's response to the escalating persecution of religious minorities in India. Nadine?
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, and good afternoon on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USERF. I thank you, as well as the Indian American Muslim Council and the other co-sponsors, for organizing this timely discussion today. I'd also like to thank Dr. Chatterjee and her esteemed colleagues for sharing their newly published report on the weaponization of citizenship in India. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to talk briefly about USERF and the work we do in promoting the universal right to freedom of religion or belief around the world. Created in 1998, International Religious Freedom Act, by the International Religious Freedom Act, USERF uses international human rights standards to monitor religious freedom globally and makes recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. USERF is an independent bipartisan commission. Commissioners are appointed by the President and the Republican and Democratic leadership of the House and the Senate. USERF issues an annual report each year, which contains information on religious freedom conditions within specific countries and policy recommendations to the U.S. government to address these concerns. The annual report specifically covers countries that USERF recommends that the State Department either designate as a country of particular concern, or a CPC, or to include on the special watch list. Under IRFA, countries of particular concern are those countries whose governments engage in or tolerate systematic, ongoing, or egregious violations of religious freedom. Our 2021 annual report, which can be found on our website at usurf.gov, covers 26 countries in detail. This year, for the second year in a row, USURF has recommended that the State Department designate India as a CPC. We also recommend that the United States advance human rights of all religious communities and promote religious freedom and dignity and interfaith dialogue through bilateral and multilateral forums and agreements. Pursuant to this recommendation, when President Biden meets with Prime Minister Modi, we urge him to raise some of the key concerns that led to our CPC recommendation for India. As the essential issue to be raised in the meeting is the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA. While the CAA is said to benefit religious minorities, including Christians, Hindus, and Sikhs, from neighboring Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, the reality is that the CAA, in conjunction with the proposed National Register of Citizens, or the NRC, requiring all residents to provide documentation of citizenship, may subject Muslims to statelessness, deportation, or prolonged detention. The CAA on its face singles out Muslims and denies them a path to citizenship afforded to persons of all other faiths. The CAA's stated purpose is to protect individuals facing religious persecution in India's neighboring countries. Yet it excludes Hindus persecuted and displaced in neighboring countries like Burma, where more than 400 Hindus live in segregation and unfathomable conditions in the Rohingya camps, and Muslim communities facing persecution, such as the Ahmadis in Pakistan or Shia Muslims in Afghanistan. An alternate to enacting the CAA that would better help the purpose would have been to simply ask those seeking citizenship whether they had faced persecution and to fast track those applicants who said they had. The CAA is significantly more worrisome when coupled with the potential nationwide NRC, which national leaders of the ruling BJP are pushing for. The fear is that the CAA, in conjunction with the planned National Population Register, the National Register of Citizens, could result in a wide-scale disenfranchisement of Indian Muslims. This would leave them vulnerable to prolonged detention, deportation, and violence. We saw this process play out in the northeast state of Assam, documented by Dr. Chatterjee's groundbreaking report, where a statewide registry was claimed as a mechanism for identifying migrants in the region. Many Indian citizens, in particular Muslims, have had their citizenship questioned and challenged by local authorities and have been excluded from the NRC despite their families having lived in India for generations. Given that the CAA only provides a pathway to citizenship for non-Muslims, the concern is that Muslims excluded by the NRC will have no recourse. A number of Indian Muslim citizens fear being sent to government-built detention camps and effectively rendered stateless in their own country. I recently spoke on an episode of USUR's Spotlight podcast regarding this report and our shared concerns regarding the situation in Assam. And I invite all who are interested to listen to this episode. As I discussed on the podcast, implementation of the nationwide NRC with the CAA in place potentially exposes millions of Indians, largely Muslims, to detention, deportation, and statelessness. The ongoing and planned use and construction of detention centers around the country is another troubling development. Reports suggest that there are 13 operational detention camps in India, with 6 of them alone in the state of Assam. Over the past year, Indians of all faiths have been exercising their peaceful right of protest to express their opposition to the CAA and related developments. Yet since its passage, we've seen a deadly crackdown by government authorities against those protesters, journalists, and advocates, and communal violence targeting Muslim communities, including Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and Assam, where mob violence, at times with no intervention by the police, has resulted in death, beatings, and the burning of Muslims and Hindus. Another area of ongoing concern that we urge President Biden to discuss with Prime Minister Modi is the spread of online speech, hate speech, and false information against religious minorities. USUR's October 2020 hearing on combating online hate speech and disinformation targeting religious communities addressed the rise of hate and disinformation online in countries around the world, including India. Government officials and societal actors continue to spread fear amidst and disinformation against religious minorities, including Dalits, Christians, Sikhs, Muslims. As one example, India is Facebook's biggest market, and its messenger service WhatsApp continues to be used to target and facilitate violence against India's religious minorities, and that too during COVID. The concerns about the targeting of religious minorities extends across social and more traditional media platforms. We've also heard reports that civil society journalists and advocates who are documenting religious violence are also being targeted as well. The rise of hate, and the targeting of religious minorities is of even deeper concern, given the additional restrictions on civil society. The September 2020 amendment to the Financial Contributions Regulation Act, or the FCRA, passed by the Indian Parliament, introduces additional guidelines, including extensive reporting requirements on NGOs, and expands the government's ability to restrict their lawful activities. These changes have had a chilling effect on NGOs, including those combating religious persecution and violence, and providing vital health and education services to religious minority communities. The closure of Amnesty International's Indian office is just one example of those increased restrictions on civil society. We're also concerned about the ongoing restrictions impacting religious freedom in Jammu and Kashmir. After the removal of Muslim majority Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy in August of 2019, through the removal of Article 370 of the Constitution, government restrictions within the state on the internet, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of movement has severely restricted religious freedom. President Biden should also raise concerns regarding the continued enforcement of anti-cow slaughter and anti-conversion laws. 21 of 28 Indian states criminalize cow slaughter in various forms. These laws are often enforced against religious minorities, including Christians, Muslims, Dalits, and Awadis communities under the guise of protecting cattle. 10 Indian states possess anti-conversion laws prohibiting religious conversion based on force, allurement, inducement, or fraud. However, some contain such broad definitions that they can be interpreted as prohibiting any kind of conversion, whether consensual or not. These laws are predominantly used to arrest Christians and Muslims. Government actions, including the continued enforcement of cow slaughter and anti-conversion laws, has also created a culture of impunity for nationwide campaigns of harassment and violence against religious minorities, including mob lynchings against individuals suspected of cow slaughter and Muslims and Christians accused of conversion activities. The recent death of 84-year-old Jesuit priest Father Stan Swami, as we heard earlier, while in pre-trial detention, points to the growing harassment and imprisonment of individuals who do not share the same ideology as the government. Individuals who try to bring awareness of India's rich history of pluralism and attempt to draw attention to the need for tolerance find their efforts thwarted. Throughout the country, political and community leaders are promulgated an ideology that suggests that to be Indian is necessary to be Hindu, and views India's religious minorities as subordinate or foreign. That ideology has taken root in policies and actions at the state level, and increasingly in proposals and appeals at the national level that are resulting in the persecution and targeting of religious minorities. In our 2020 annual report, we made several recommendations to the US government to improve religious freedom conditions in India. In addition to the recommendations that I've already mentioned regarding the CPC designation and raising religious freedom concerns in bilateral and multilateral forums, we've also recommended that targeted sanctions be imposed on government officials and entities responsible for severe violations of religious freedom by freezing those individuals or entities' assets and barring their entry into the United States. We also urge the United States government to publicly condemn ongoing religious freedom violations in India and come to the aid of religious organizations and human rights groups being targeted for their advocacy of religious freedom. And finally, we ask the United States Congress to continue to raise religious freedom concerns in their US-India bilateral relationships and highlight concerns through hearings, briefing, letters, and visiting congressional delegations. USCIRF will continue to raise the alarm regarding the ongoing religious freedom violations in India and advocate for the implementation of these recommendations. Thank you again for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you, Nadine, for that wonderful presentation. We always support you and your efforts, and we appreciate all your support in the Commission and making the time today to be with us today. We know you are not a stranger for issues in India. You have a long history of interaction with them, and we greatly appreciate your leadership. Next, we have with us Mr. Harsh Mandar. Now, I would like to, Mr. Harsh Mandar is a renowned activist from India, globally recognized for his work. He is currently being severely persecuted by the Modi government for speaking out. Harsh is the Richard von, hope I'll say it right, Weizsäcker Fellows of the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, Germany. Hours after he left for his fellowship in Berlin this month, Modi government officials charged him with financial irregularities and asked investigating agencies to raid his residences, where they interrogated his daughter alone for 18 hours, and his offices were, they spent about 20 hours in his offices. So they also raided a street children's home that the officials, the Indian officials, under the direction of the Modi government, raided a street children's home that Harsh helped set up years ago, but doesn't manage anymore. In affidavits submitted to the India Supreme Court, the Modi administration has falsely accused Harsh of fostering hate and insurrection when his work has resolutely opposed to divisive hate policies targeting India's minority religious communities. Harsh is a former top civil servant in India who quit the lucrative and prestigious job to become a human rights and peace worker, writer, columnist, researcher, and a teacher. He works with survivors of violence, mass violences, and hunger, homelessness, and street children. His books include Locking Down the Poor, The Pandemic and India's Moral Center, Looking Away, Inequality, Prejudice, and Indifference in India, and Ash in the Belly, India's Unfinished Battle Against Hunger. He has a PhD from the Rijke University in Amsterdam. His thesis was titled Vulnerable People and Policy Developments in India, Designing State Interventions for Hunger, Homelessness, Destitute, and Targeted Violence. He teaches courses on poverty and governance in Indian and international universities. As member of Indian Prime Minister's National Advisory Council from June 2010 to 2012, he convened many working groups, including the Food Security Bill, Disability Rights, Bonded Labor, Street Vendors Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Bill, Manual Scavenging Abolition, and co-convening the group on the Communal and Targeted Violence Bill. He was also a special commissioner to the Supreme Court of India for 12 years, investigating starvation deaths, interviewing and implementation and directing public policy reform for advancing the right to food and nutrition in several states in India. In 2017, he established and led the important national initiative, which he called the Karwan-e-Mohabbat, or the Caravan of Love, to try to counter rising hate and fear in the country, but not with hate, instead with love and solidarity. The Karwan visits the families of those who lost loved ones to hate violence and lynching for atonement, solidarity, healing, conscience, and justice. Harsh?
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Nadine. And thank you all those who have joined this call. The Indian Republic is passing through a moment of immense crisis of democracy, of a depth, of a ferocity, and of a range unmatched in the 75 years of the existence of India as an independent modern nation. The only parallels with this crisis are India's 18-month emergency in the 1970s. There are many similarities. There was an abridgment of fundamental rights and freedoms, large-scale jailing of the political opposition, and suspension of the media and of judicial independence. All of these we do see in the India of today, in what is described by many as an undeclared emergency. But because it is undeclared, it is so much more sinister. Unlike the earlier emergency, it has no end date. It has a much wider, deeper social base. And it is characterized by runaway crony capitalism. And above all, most gravely, it is a hate project. In the few minutes I have with you, let me talk about what I see as the most worrying threats to India's democracy. The earlier speakers have spoken about what I would describe as an open war of the state against India's Muslims and Dalits, to reduce them to a life of fear, to be subject routinely to abuse, bigotry from the official leadership, violence by vigilante groups condoned by the police, and laws which formally give lesser rights to citizenship based on their religious and caste identity. Let me take just a few prominent markers. One of them is absolutely runaway hate speech, what one could call VIP hate speech. Hate speech is given by the Union Home Minister, by chief ministers, which are openly full of bigotry, taunting India's minorities, particularly India's Muslims. It's important to remember the lessons of history, the recent history. It has been said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. They began in hate speech. And in that sense, we are hurtling towards something very grave by how commonplace hate speech against India's Muslims has become. We see the changing of road names, city names, anything that reflects our common Islamic identity is sought to be erased. Although we have 200 million Muslim residents, equal citizens in every way, and we have a civilization of shared, of a shared culture, very rich shared culture, where the Islamic contributions are closely tied with those that preceded and followed. We're seeing gang rapes with no justice of teenage Dalit girls. We're seeing, perhaps most frighteningly, the project of lynching. This mob lynching from the year 2016-17, mobs gathering and beating to death publicly, mostly Muslim men, sometimes Dalit men, in the name of protecting the cow. There was a stunning silence of the majority community, and a continuous condoning of this by people in power, which is why we launched what I called the Karwan-e-Mohabbat. This was really a caravan of love. We resolved that we would go to every home where somebody has been lost to hate violence, to say that there are many people in this country who care, and that you're not alone, that we seek forgiveness for what we become as a country. We are with you in your battles for justice and to rebuild your lives, and we will tell your story. We had started with a journey of 1 month, but we realized how much it meant. And we continued right up to the time of the lockdown. We made about 30 journeys to far corners of the country, to the homes. And what we saw was terrifying by any standards. The similarities actually with the lynching of African Americans from the late 19th to almost the mid 20th century are very striking, because these were performative acts of violence. We were struck by the extreme cruelty, firstly, of the violence. Families would say, I wish they just shot him. I wish they just knifed him to death. Why did they torture him so much? Why did they gouge out his eyes, smash his genitals? The same cruelty again that we saw in the lynchings in America. But the performative character was replaced not by large gatherings, but by the video camera. Each of these lynchings are videotaped with the perpetrators clearly visible and widely circulated and consumed on WhatsApp to settle fear in some hearts and hate in others. The role of the police is extremely partisan, we found everywhere, and there was a sort of a frightening silence by people of the majority community. We're seeing, what are called love jihad laws, which make interfaith marriages subject of criminal investigation by adults, with frightening echoes of the Nuremberg laws. I could go on. But there are other wars as well. There's a war against informal labor, the pandemic. We had the harshest, biggest lockdown in the world, probably in human history, with among the smallest relief packages. But what is really important to know is that when the Prime Minister asks us to stay at home, we have to have a home. If he says keep social distance, how will people who live in one-room shanties, 10 people, how are they going to keep social distance and so on? 9 out of 10 workers are informal workers. So even the design of what the state wanted to try to do during the lockdown excluded the poor, but it's placed the greatest burdens on their shoulders. There's the breakdown of all institutions of a democracy. Just take a few examples. The higher judiciary has been far less conspicuous in defending the rights of minorities. There's the Election Commission, which we were very proud of for its independence. It's got more and more eroded. A group of retired civil servants called the Constitutional Conduct Group is investigating and finding troubling evidence of partisanship by the Election Commission, the higher civil services and the police, and of course the media. And with all of this, I must mention briefly Assam. It has been mentioned earlier as well, and the report led by Angana, I put out the link. But I think that it's important to see that this as probably the biggest project in a modern democracy for creating statelessness, or for actually shifting the blame, the burden to prove that you're not an illegal immigrant, on people to produce documents 50 years, 60 years old to prove that your ancestors belong to this country. I wouldn't be able to produce those documents in a country with very little history of documentation and the kind of distress it created. And then, of course, the jailing of dissidents, charging them with the gravest crimes of terror or very serious financial crimes that could lead, if proved, to sending people in prison for the rest of their lives. We heard of Father Stan Swami, a great hero, completely unbroken at that age for his fight for justice. And we have a lot of very wonderful idealistic young people spending years in jail with little hope of release. The only hope has been solidarity that was displayed in nationwide battles against the citizenship law and now in the farmers' protests. The protests were founded on fraternity, on Hindu-Muslim unity, and a new idiom of resistance, which is founded on love and non-violence, that can be traced to what is found in our freedom struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh, for that wonderful presentation. You are a hope for a lot of people in India, and we greatly admire your work. And thank you for making the time to be with us in spite of having being under tremendous pressure. We are kind of running very short on time. We may go a couple of minutes over our time limit, but let me introduce you to you. John Shifton, our speaker now. He is the Advocacy Director on Human Rights for the Human Rights Watch. John has joined our platform several times before to shine light on the egregious violences of religious human rights and religious freedom, especially on social and religious minorities in India. Human Rights Watch team in India has for years done an excellent job of chronicling the abject failure of the Indian state to ensure constitutional guarantees of freedom for all. John previously served as a researcher and an acting deputy at the acting deputy Washington director for Human Rights Watch. He focuses on Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Middle East terrorism and counterterrorism issues worldwide. Shifton began working on Human Rights Watch in 2001 for first as a researcher on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then as the senior researcher on terrorism and counterterrorism. John?
Thank you. I want to start by saying that a written version of my remarks has been posted now online at my organization's website, hrw.org/Asia/India. The previous panelists have laid out many of the issues outlined in that written document, and I don't want to repeat all the details, whether it's about the increasing crackdown on civil society and media, to the most serious issue of all, in our view, the worsening atmosphere with respect to religious freedom and the increasing discrimination against and physical attacks on religious minorities. The bottom line is what President Biden and his staff need to acknowledge as they prepare to meet with Prime Minister Modi, and what members of Congress need to impress on the administration right now, is that the facts are now clear. Attacks against religious minorities in India, and especially Muslims, have increased dramatically, and especially since the Hindu nationalist BJP came to power in 2014. They are speaking to the leader of that party. So he is responsible for that increasing toxicity and those increasing attacks. And what the Biden administration needs to acknowledge really is the sheer scope of the problem, the sheer scope of the toxicity of the hate. Now, BJP leaders and affiliated groups have long stigmatized minority communities as threats to national security, the Hindu way of life, but the BJP government in power has gone much further and sort of exponentially increased the rhetoric and adopted laws and policies that now systematically discriminate against religious minorities, in particular Muslims, and stigmatize critics of the government when they criticize them for these actions. And the divisive political discourse has served to normalize private violence against minorities by ordinary Indians, especially violence against Muslims. And prejudices that are embedded in the government have now infiltrated independent institutions, the police, and, others, and even the media. And it's empowered nationalist groups acting on their own to threaten, harass, and attack religious minorities with impunity. And Prime Minister Modi has sat atop all this as the BJP has encouraged this. The other thing I want to just emphasize, it was referred to previously by several panelists, is the actual hate speech that BJP leaders have used. And really, the Biden administration needs to understand that this isn't a problem of worsening churn of religious tensions between different groups. This is something being stoked at the highest levels of government by BJP leaders. So a few examples. When protests broke out 2 years ago against the highly discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act discussed by previous panelists, BJP authorities attempted to discredit the protesters against it, particularly Muslims, by accusing them of conspiring against the government, against the national interest. They accused them essentially of treason. Similarly, after the farmers' protests, starting in November 2020, senior BJP leaders and their supporters on social media and pro-government media began blaming Sikhs as an entire group, claiming that the protests had a Khalistani agenda, a reference to the Sikh separatist insurgency in the 80s and 90s. In February 2021, Prime Minister Modi in Parliament described people participating in protests as, quote, parasites, and calling international criticism, basically a foreign destructive ideology. Parasites. I mean, we at Human Rights Watch know well what happens when leaders start describing their own people, human beings, with the names of hated insects. But it isn't the first time. I mean, during discussions of the Citizenship Amendment Act, Home Minister Amit Shah said, illegal immigrants are like termites, and they're eating the food supposed to go to our poor, and they are taking our jobs. He promised that if we come to power, we will find each and every one and send them away. That is extraordinarily dangerous and toxic language to use. It's also the scare tactics that have become part of the larger tactic of the BJP. We saw it, for instance, in UP, HP, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat, when BJP leaders were arguing for the so-called anti-conversion laws. They used the phrase love jihad, a baseless theory that Muslim men lure Hindu women into marriages and convert them to Islam, another scare tactic. So it's really important that the Biden administration understand that these toxicities are being cultivated by the BJP, and that when they see Prime Minister Modi, they're not just seeing the Prime Minister of India, they're seeing the leader of the BJP. And he is complicit in this intensifying rhetoric. Now, since time is short, my written remarks go into a lot of other issues, including bias against Muslims and the justice system. As we know, in the protests, a large number of people have been picked up, a lot of Muslims, a lot of Hindus, but we've seen that non-Muslims, or I should say Hindus, are far more likely to be bailed, far less likely to be charged. I mean, it is Muslims who are bearing the brunt of the effort to investigate using the criminal legal system protesters. Meanwhile, efforts to get BJP leaders investigated for inciting violence have gone nowhere. A Delhi court in 2020 said it had no actionable evidence against BJP leaders of inciting violence, despite the existence of videos of them advocating violence, complaints by witnesses, transcripts of messages the police submitted in court. So it was evidence, so we're seeing this issue where on the one hand, the police are going after Muslims, on the other hand, just ignoring BJP leaders inciting violence. And there's other examples in the written version of my remarks. I also discuss in my remarks that we posted online the whole issue of empowering vigilantes, and in particular the mushrooming cow protection groups that previous panelists have discussed, which we've written lengthy reports about, all of which are on our website. I also discussed the crackdown on civil society, but on the recommendations, I mean, I've already made them. President Biden needs to be aware of all these issues, and he needs to find a way to speak to Prime Minister about these concerns in a way that will lead Prime Minister Modi to go back to and take actions that will scale back the BJP's hateful rhetoric and the effects that it's having on civil society and the whole civil atmosphere in India. How does President Biden do that? Well, it's not easy. And we have to also acknowledge that there are human rights issues that Prime Minister Modi could raise with President Biden, including the waiver of intellectual property on life-saving medicines and COVID vaccines, which could save millions of lives. So he can raise those issues. Prime Minister Modi can raise issues about the increasingly toxic rhetoric in the United States against minorities, against Asians in the context of the COVID pandemic, and against African Americans in the context of worsening racial relations in the United States. He can discuss these, and that, in my mind, is the way into this. Both Prime Minister Modi and President Biden can discuss it in a shared acknowledgement that their countries are facing serious problems. Now, the US Congress has a lot of a role to play here too, and they can press the administration, and more importantly, press the Indian government through the embassy in Washington or through visits to India, and remind them again and again that the President of the United States is but one branch of the government, and that when it comes to increasing trade and military cooperation, all of that, Congress is the ultimate arbiter of those agreements. And if Congress is very disturbed about India's increasingly toxic atmosphere with respect to free speech, but also religious minorities, it's going to be increasingly difficult to just pass these growing efforts to bring the US and India together. So I think that's Congress's main role. The specifics of what they should ask of India, from repealing laws, this effort, discarding the plans for a national register of citizens, and all that, I go into in my written remarks. But the main thing is that Congress needs to know it has a role here, both in pressing the administration and in communicating to the Indian government directly. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that remarks. You have brought home the major concerns that we have and how it should be addressed in Washington by the current administration. We have a few questions. We could take a few minutes to discuss those questions. And I believe the first question is to do with how things are happening in India. For this may be a question for Harsh. And by the way, during my introduction, I did mention that when Harsh Mander left for Germany a few days ago, the day he left, his offices were raided, his home was raided by the officials. This kind of harassment goes on a daily basis. We hear about it when it happens to Harsh Mander or to another high-profile politician in the country, but we don't hear when smaller organizations, Christian, Muslim, Dalit organizations, or anyone with a Twitter account making it a tweet that the government officials find it problematic or insulting. They have a very thin skin, to put it simply, and they go after them. When the power of the state comes down on an individual like that, the world has to wake up and start talking about it, instead of saying India is the largest democracy and America is the oldest democracy. India doesn't qualify to be a democracy, only to hold elections. Only it will qualify only if it respects the values of a democracy. So with that, let me also ask this question from a listener, from an audience. How is the US government mapping or tracking political activists and dissidents who have been jailed without due process in India? How is the US government raising concerns regarding these Indian citizens who have been jailed on dubious charges? That part maybe Nadine could address that. Maybe first, can Harsh please take that call?
Thank you. I'm not really aware if and how the US government is tracking, so I'd be happy. But I do believe that, I liked the point that John made. I think that all our countries are passing through assaults on democratic rights. I think the one difference is that we cannot claim that Mr. Biden's politics is centered around the violation of minority rights or democratic rights, and I think that that's the one big difference. But all our societies have to introspect. Tracking within India has actually become really difficult. I was part of 3 efforts with leading news magazines, etc., to establish hate crime trackers. The results were really frightening. 86% of lynching after 2010 happened after Mr. Modi came to power. 94%, I think, 97%, sorry. And 84% of the people killed were Muslim, 8% were Dalit, and so on. So that kind of data is extremely important. Likewise, among people who are the political dissidents. There's very little recording of it and acknowledgement of it, even within India officially. And it's important that we do it in civil society. It's important that other governments who are interested in India's democratic performance also find ways to do.
Thank you. Nadine, how do you think we could, or the US government here, different agencies in the US government, could respond or address these serious concerns that people have? As I said, when it happens to a high-profile person, when it happens to when it happened to Father Stan Swami, we were able to, we heard about it, a lot of newspaper articles, but it's happening to a small guy in a small town. How do we address this menace?
And
Right.
if I could just jump in very quickly and add a short more question for Commissioner Menza, given that USERF does so much work advocating for prisoners of conscience and people who are in prison for their beliefs or their religion, and we know that in India today there are so many Muslims who are in prison, such as Umar Khalid and many other activists. And given that we just heard the details of the case for which Harsh is being harassed and interrogated by the Indian government, I think many of us would appreciate just a short statement or some remarks from you as a commissioner of USERF on the specific case that one of our panelists is undergoing, and of course the questions that John just raised. Thank you.
Right. Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to mention that we do, of course, have a prisoners of conscience effort at USERF, and we have a freedom of religion or belief victims list, which Stan Swami was on it. So we're very narrow focused on religious freedom. So, there has to be a religious component. Obviously, we speak out, of course, about activists and journalists and others who are being targeted, because we know that that's a marker that points to problems, and we write about India and we talk about it. Of course, we frame it and all that. And I'm so sorry about all that you've gone through, standing up for what is right and being a voice for religious freedom and for freedoms, all freedoms. I think what you're seeing in the U.S. government is, USERF is an independent agency, so we have this freedom to speak out. We try to be truth tellers. We try to put on blinders as to the geopolitical relationship we have with the country, because that's the State Department's decision. What we do is we call out the truth. This is, the kind of atrocities we're seeing. These are the kinds of religious freedom conditions. And regardless of your relationship with the United States, we're going to document it, and then we hand it off to the State Department. And of course, the Congress, the President, Secretary of State, and say these are the realities as we see them, as we've independently assessed them in a bipartisan way. But what you see is the U.S. government follows a very strict policy, so their people don't have the freedom to speak out. So that's why you're not seeing, other agencies speak out about the kind of things we're speaking out about, because it's tightly held. And, so it's important for civil society to speak up and to fill that gap, media to report the truth, Congress to hold hearings, to be able, as we've recommended, draw attention to these situations, briefings like this one that we're trying to highlight, both on social media and participating, to get out the truth, get it passed, because the US government just hasn't had the kind of, in the last several years, they have not called out the way that we had hoped they would, the kind of situation that's happening on the ground. And so our recommendation is, a good, India is a good friend of the United States, and good friends should be calling out these truths, should be attaching, our support to benchmarks, should be being very transparent with them. So I'm hoping these conversations with President Biden and Modi will have, that give the president the opportunity to bring up a lot of the problems that we see, because if we're good friends, that's what we'll do. The people of India deserve us to be friends to them by being advocates for their ability to practice their faith freely and have the rights that they had in the past, especially the religious minorities, of course, that are being targeted. So it's a complex situation, but at the same time, it's simple, which is just the truth they are clearly, as we've documented, conditions there that are problematic, that they can no longer be ignored by the US government.
Yeah, thank you. John Shifton, there is a question about, perhaps you could address this issue. There is a collusion between an elected government and large business houses at the expense of the small guy on the, in the village level. In your experience, how do you see that kind of a policy playing out in a country like India? I mean, you're familiar with Indian areas, and Govind and Harsh, if you have thoughts on it, please feel free to jump in.
Well, I actually think that corporate actors are going to be corporate actors with any government, and they're going to chase power because power will make them more profitable. So instead of discussing that, I would focus instead on the far more problematic issue of the United States government and other governments essentially giving a pass to the fact that a political party and its ideological backbone, the RSS, is essentially taking over a country and making it a one-party state. And I think we should focus on things like, for instance, the acting charge d'affaires, Atul Kashyap, the US charge d'affaires, acting ambassador, meeting with the head of the RSS. What was the purpose of that meeting? What was discussed? That was extraordinarily troubling that he would meet with somebody who plays a role in that organization, unless he was warning them, unless he was laying down an ultimatum, which it doesn't sound like he was. It was an extraordinarily troubling meeting and speaks to the fact that the US government is not in the right posture in dealing the leadership of India such as it is. Instead of acknowledging what's going on here, we're essentially acting as though it's business as usual. Meeting with the head of a paramilitary, ideologically driven organization that promotes extraordinarily racist and some might say even autocratic ideas is highly troubling. Meet with the leaders of the government. You have to do that. That's what diplomacy is. But that entire meeting sent a terrible message. And I bring it up because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about turning a page in the US government, both Congress and the administration and subsequent administrations, really making it clear and sending a strong message that they don't like what's going on and that they don't see a future in a partnership with a country that's led not by democratic leaders, but by essentially a one-party, by a party as opposed to democratically elected leaders.
Harsh, how do you see the collusion between large business houses and politics playing out at the grassroots level? What kind of impact it's having, economic impact it's having to the people in a country like India?
We're seeing the pattern is very clear that we always had a space for the private sector and for the public sector. We had a mixed economy. But we're seeing systematically about 3 big business houses actually being, getting super rich, and the destruction even of public sector units through all of this. The farmers' protests that are happening, actually, I think, the first major protest I know about, which is truly about crony capitalism. It is about as much against the new farm laws, which would actually open up small farmers to the power of private corporations. It is a complex question. I think people of India are making their choices. But there is a great deal of worry about an economic model. Neoliberalism is still something else. Crony capitalism is of a different degree altogether. So I think that is a major concern for the Indian people.
Govind, any thoughts?
Well, I don't know enough about the nexus between crony capitalism and the Indian government to speak on that. However, I will go back to the brief comments just to mention that I would very much second what John Sifton was saying about the U.S. government and its relationship with India. I mean, the Quad also does worry me in terms of them willing to sort of perhaps speak on human rights privately, but maybe not call it out publicly, or maybe not even speak out on it privately. And the reason is that there's so much focus on sort of encircling China that I worry that the Quad has may play an outsized role in the Biden administration as we go forward. So we want to make sure that that relationship is fine to continue, but it needs to be done on the basis of promoting human rights.
Thank you. I want to ask Harshnandar and Nadine an important development a couple of weeks ago. Of course, the ambassador representing the U.S. in India, one of his jobs is to meet with different parties, even those they don't agree with. But how do you see the acting charge d'affaires, Mr. Ambassador Atul Keshav, meeting with political leaders and civil society leaders at the embassy, but going to Nagpur to meet with an RSS leader, and an organization that espoused, it's very unapologetically, a Hindu supremacist idea. And that meeting was not even a private meeting. It was a very publicized meeting. How do you see that, Harsh?
Well, I find it appalling, actually. Unequivocally, everybody knows that the sort of ideological lodestar of the present government is the RSS. The Prime Minister, it's one moment in our history today when the four highest constitutional positions, the President, the Vice President, the Prime Minister, and the Speaker of the Parliament, are all men who've spent their entire adult lives and continue to be members of the RSS. There's no secret that the RSS never accepted India's, our notion of a secular democracy, which is founded on the notion of both religious freedom, but also equal rights to people of every faith. Now, when you have somebody, you have to meet, of course, you have to meet the Prime Minister, you have to meet political leaders across the spectrum. You can see that as your business. But the RSS is not any of these things, and it gives a certain the RSS literature, actually its early literature is frankly admiring of German fascism, for instance. So how do you deal with somebody who's giving that kind of legitimacy today? It's not just, the ambassadors who've also gone and visited the RSS. It's a very worrying trend. I think it needs to be unequivocally opposed.
Thank you. Nadine, do you have thoughts on that?
It's hard to know precisely what the purpose of that was, but my concern, of course, would be to normalize this Hindu nationalism as a legitimate ideology. That is dangerous in any country. When you look at in Myanmar, you look at the United States, you look at India, any sort of this nationalism that has an in party and an out group and an in group just can't be normalized and be treated like a normal ideology or some sort of religious freedom type approach, because it's not. It's excluding, it's the opposite of religious freedom. So that concerns me, and I think rightfully so that you called that out, and these are the kind of things that I think the US government needs to think about in terms of how they approach the Indian government and how they encourage good behavior and encourage a pluralistic society, which is such a beautiful part of India's history. And so many people in India want to go back to those days where they did have these religions living together peacefully. And so that's the kind of thing that the US government should be encouraging, not in any way normalizing this ideology.
Yeah. Agree. We will take two more questions before we end the session. One is perhaps this is a good question for Harsh again. At the grassroots level, do you see an interreligious coalitions building between the Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus, or do you see a widening gap? Would you like to see a much better cooperation, and what would be your suggestions?
You know, I must confess that during those years of lynching and the silences that we saw surrounding it, somebody who's very optimistic, as hopeful as being central to my politics, I was beginning to feel a sense of despair. But the protests that broke out against the Citizenship Amendment Act, we must remember that it was the largest peaceful protest that occurred nationwide after the freedom struggle. And everywhere there were displays for 100 days spontaneously of Hindus and Muslims standing together. I was invited to rallies all across the country during those 100 days of the protest before the lockdown shut it all down. But they were exhilarating because you saw ordinary Hindus and Muslims coming together for a law that discriminated against Muslims. We saw in colleges and universities across the country, you saw the kind of spirit of solidarity that many people would not have imagined existed. So I think there's a very large consensus. 38% people voted in 2019 for Mr. Modi on a very clearly divisive platform, but 62% did not. And one should not forget that. I think that there's a very large segment, the majority of both Hindus and Muslims and Christians, who don't believe in religious hatred. It's worrying, for instance, that a bishop in Kerala, spoke recently, in a language that was clearly Islamophobic. So we need to stand together. The battle is not between Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs. The battle is between people who misuse religion for hate and those who respect each other. You follow your own faith, respect each other. I think we all have to see our community together, and I'm very hopeful that India still hasn't broken down as a pluralist civilization.
Thank you. You rightly said this is not a fight between the Hindus and Christians or Hindus and Muslims. It is a fight for the survival of the idea of India, that together India will either survive or we hope it won't end up like Pakistan or other countries having taken on this path of religious nationalism. We all know how religious nationalism in Sri Lanka, in Burma, and other places have played out. So hopefully, the common sense will prevail. We are all praying for it. Amrijit Singh has a question. He said he is talking about the foreign minister of India. He's the same guy who was very mean to Compassion International and he was very instrumental in throwing out Compassion International. Personally invested, as I was told, in that whole episode. He seems to be very emotional. Now, when the Secretary of State, Blinken, went to India, they had a joint statement or a press conference or meeting in which he said, well, India is ready to address the historical injustices. We know what he means by it, historical injustices, but is that the way a matured government official of a democratic nation, which wants to be a member of the UN Security Council, would talk about in public about things that happened in India 800 years ago, 900 years ago. But how will that play out today in the Quad meetings? Anyone? Any thoughts? John, what do you think?
I suppose what is meant by historical injustices? I mean, that could mean a lot of things. But
well, his idea is that if I assume that when the Persian and the Mughals, when they came into the country, they were, the whole argument from the RSS side is that they plundered Indian wealth, and they did all those horrible things to the society, the Hindu society or the Indian society, and that now it is their time to take revenge. That the historical injustices should be rectified.
Yeah.
How would we, and common of this thing, how would we see it?
That type of rhetoric is always poisonous. It is the rhetoric of resentment or resentment. It's the rhetoric that leads people to foment hatreds, ancient hatreds as new hatreds. It's the rhetoric that leads you to, the use of other rhetoric like insects and termites, and it just needs to be put aside. And if a US official is meeting with somebody, they should immediately flip to, the script of the US government. In most of these situations, the US government has blood on its hands from one continent to another. And they just have to flip the script and say, we have to move forward and pledge to devote ourselves to pluralism, democracy, human rights, and the rest. We can acknowledge the sins of the past and the injustices of the past, but it's not really useful. But again, that brings me back to why it was so disturbing that a US official met with the head of RSS. And I want to be clear about what was disturbing. Obviously, US diplomats are entitled to meet with private actors. They meet with heads of political parties and countries, heads of opposition, journalists, musicians, there's cultural, that's okay. But when there is a ideological organization that is either taking over a country and basically undermining its pluralism and democracy, or has done so already, or has used hateful, racist, or authoritarian rhetoric, that's a group that must be avoided, because simply meeting, endorsing the idea that they have some kind of legitimacy in the Indian political world, in the Indian political system. And that's why it was so problematic. It doesn't matter if the US can say diplomats are entitled to meet with all parties, or diplomats, that we use the occasion to impress strong principles. If that's so, the benefits were outweighed by the costs. The costs were far, far higher. Just to be clear, the United States does not meet with party heads in one-party states. We don't go to the Vietnam Communist, the United States does not attend the Vietnam Communist Party's, General Assembly Jubilee. Just as the US ambassador to Germany in 1933 did not attend Nazi rallies in Nuremberg. You don't do that. You meet with other people. You do not meet with one party, state party leaders. Meet with the government. Don't meet with party leaders who have overturned democracy, and certainly don't meet with them when they are spouting such hateful and dangerous rhetoric.
Thank you. Very thoughtful remarks. Well, can't believe it's been more than 95 minutes of engaging discussions. We are at the end of our session today, and I would like to draw your attention to our YouTube channel. Please do visit the YouTube channel, and if you would like to share this video with others, please feel free to do so. And I would like to again thank all our panelists and audiences for an engaging an hour and a half. Thank you, and we will meet again next week in another episode of Congressional Briefings.